So why, I hear you ask yourselves, am I standing in front of my car with a bucket? Well, either I'm going to wash it in front of you, and yeah, that might be a plan, but otherwise I'm going to use it as an analogy to try to demystify some of the terminology around electric cars. So hopefully at this point I've piqued your interest in electric cars just enough that you might be looking around at what exists and what limitations they may have and how that fits your lifestyle. But you might find yourself overwhelmed by some of the terminology because some of it is a bit different from what we've been used to before. But never fear, help us at hand, this video is here to try and demystify it for you. So the first thing we need to talk about with the bucket is energy, and that's equivalent to your battery size. The size of the bucket is equivalent to the size of the battery in this analogy. And this, in energy terms, is measured in kilowatt hours. There are actually two measures that you need to be aware of. One of them is the gross or total capacity of the battery, and the other one is the usable. Now, sometimes manufacturers don't quote both, and that's fine, but just be aware that they are very slightly different. And the reason they're slightly different is because of the buffer, the bit of the battery that you're not allowed to use, which is one of the ways in which they help ensure that they have a very long lifetime. So the gross includes that buffer, whereas the usable is the amount that you can get out of the battery every day, and is probably a more useful figure if you can find that out. Now be careful with battery size. I mean, theoretically, it's very easy to assume that a bigger battery is better because it gives you more range. And there is some truth to that in the sense that, you know, a smaller battery is going to reduce your range, but bigger is not necessarily better. Efficiency is actually more important. So a car with a smaller battery, but which is more efficient, may give you more range than a car which is got a very large battery, but which is not very efficient at all. Remember that a bigger battery is going to cost more and it's going to be heavier. And the cost is probably one of the things that is driving the overall cost of the EV. So you don't just want to look at the cars with the biggest battery, because then you might price yourself out of the market. So the next thing we need to talk about with our bucket analogy is power. Power is the speed at which we can empty and fill the buckets. In electrical terms, power is measured in kilowatts. There are generally two power ratings you'll see listed in the tech specs, so it's important that we cover that there are two so that you can understand the difference between them. So the first one is the motor power. The motor power is the speed at which we can empty our bucket. The faster we can empty the bucket, the more quickly we will accelerate at higher speeds. This is very similar to brake horsepower in an internal combustion engine car. And indeed, you can convert from kilowatts to brake horsepower by multiplying by 1.35. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. As I say, power tends to give us acceleration at higher speeds. At low speeds, torque is generally a bit more important actually, and EVs generally have lots of torque. Now, I'm not going to cover torque in a great deal of detail, mainly because it's measured in the same way as it is in an internal combustion engine car. So the second power figure we might see is broken down into two subsections, but this is about the charging power. So this is how quickly we can refill our bucket when we're in a hurry. As I say, you may see two different speeds listed. One of them is the DC rapid charging maximum power, and the other one is the AC charging power. So the DC rapid charging maximum power is often quoted, but I think it's important not to be too carried away by that. People can be a bit obsessed by that figure, when actually all that is a peak speed, and it might be that the car gives you a very good peak speed but for a very short period of time, which actually doesn't fill the car any quicker. So the average time taken to do a fill is more important, and that is often quoted as well. What you will often see is a 10 to 80% recharge time, and that's quite a useful real-world measure. Now we go 10 to 80, not because we're trying to cover things up, but because that's fairly real-world typical of what you might do on a road trip. It's unlikely that you would run your car to absolutely flat just because you might get nervous as you get closer to a charger, wondering if it's going to work. And so stopping with about 10% left is something that's not uncommon. And then when we're on a road trip, we might only charge to about 80% because the 80 to 100% time tends to be very long. It's very slow to do that bit. So if you're in a hurry, then don't try to charge to 100%, just try to go to 80%. The next thing to demystify for you might be charging methods, because there are two different charging methods on most modern EVs. That is DC rapid charging and AC charging. DC rapid charging is very fast, but it uses very big, very heavy and very expensive equipment, and therefore there will always be fewer DC rapid chargers than there are anything else. We use DC rapid charging when we're doing road tripping. AC charging is slower. AC charging uses the car's onboard charger instead, and therefore the charging speed is limited by how big and how heavy that charger can be. However, AC charge points are much cheaper to install, they are much simpler, and therefore there will always be lots of them. We can use AC charging when we're in less of a hurry, for example when the car is parked up and we're not using it. That can happen if we're at a destination, or if we're lucky enough when we're at home. Now, I'm not going to cover the charging connectors that are used for DC or AC charging in this video. I already have a video on the technology associated with the different charging methods, which you might want to look at after this video if you're interested. The next thing to talk about is efficiency. In the UK, we measure efficiency in miles per kilowatt hour, and that's also used in the United States. When we're talking miles per kilowatt hour, a bigger number is better, because that means we get more distance for the amount of energy used. In Europe, Australia and New Zealand, however, they tend to use watt hours per kilometre, or possibly kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres, which is a bit more similar to the way they measure efficiency of internal combustion engine cars. If you're going to use those figures, then the smaller the number is, the better, because that's less energy for the same distance travelled. The next thing to talk about is range. Range comes from a combination of the size of the battery and the efficiency of the car. Now, how you work out the range is quite complex because it does vary a bit depending on conditions. Efficiency decreases with increasing speed, and that's because air resistance increases with the square of the speed of the car. It's also true to say that there is less energy available from the battery in winter, and you may also use a little bit more energy in order to heat the cabin, although that seems to be a less relevant part of that discussion. Now, your range can reduce by up to 30% in extreme cases in cold, wet winter conditions. But that is an extreme. You won't see that all the time through the winter, so don't worry about that. So with all that information at hand, it's time to test our newfound knowledge. Let's do a case study, and why don't we use the Renault Zoe, since that's what I own. Here's one I found listed on Auto Trader by Car Giant. It's a black one, £11,700 at the time of recording. So this is listed as a Renault Zoe R135, 52 kilowatt hour, GT line, auto, 5-door, I rapid charge. Blimey, what's all that about then? It sounds intimidating, doesn't it? Well, let's see if we can break it down and make some sense of it. Firstly, R135 is talking about the motor that's fitted to the car. This is a 135 brake horsepower motor. Renault uses brake horsepower rather than quoting a kilowatt figure in the majority of their marketing materials, which makes it a bit easier for us because we're more used to brake horsepower, but some other manufacturers will use kilowatts. Now remember, I said earlier that converting kilowatts to brake horsepower is done by multiplying by 1.35, and so those of you who can do maths will realise that this is a 100 kilowatt motor on this Renault Zoe. 52 kilowatt hour is the battery size. This is the biggest of the batteries that's been fitted to a Renault Zoe. They started their lives with just 22 kilowatt hour batteries. And then they launched a 41 kilowatt hour in the ZE40, and then the ZE50, the latest car, had a 52 kilowatt hour battery. So that's what we have here. GT line is the spec, the trim. That's the top of the range at this particular age of car. Now they have changed the trim names a little bit, the model variants, a little bit over its life. So if you were looking at something that's a bit newer, you may need to check what the newest trims are called. But at this age of car, the GT line is a good one to have. All electric cars are autos, so although the listings will often say auto, we can kind of ignore that with an EV because all EVs are effectively autos. In fact, they don't have a gearbox, but they drive as if they're an automatic. All Renault Zoes are also 5-door, so although they put that in the listing, we can effectively ignore that. All Renault Zoes have 5 doors. Now the I is important here. That means that it's a battery-owned car. The battery in this car is included in the price. That's not always the case, and we'll come back to that later. The rapid charge bit is also important, so we want to see that in a listing. That's optional for most model years of the Renault Zoe. There are a couple of very recent models which have rapid charge by default, but not all of them. So we need to check that a car supports rapid charge when we're buying a Zoe. So what's not listed here? Well, there are a couple of specs that aren't listed at the moment. The AC charging power, maximum charging power on AC, is 22 kilowatts on Zoe. That's an unusual level. It's very common for you to only get 7 kilowatts or so on most cars, but the Zoe is capable of more, which is great. The DC maximum rapid charging speed is 46 kilowatts, where the car is fitted with DC rapid charging. And the range, well, the range on mine at the moment is about 170 to 235 miles. That's about the best you can do. It will be at its lowest on the motorway in winter and when it's raining. Now the Renault Zoe has quite a reasonable warranty on some years, so let's talk about that for a moment. It does vary based upon the age of the car. On my car, it has a whole car warranty of 5 years or 100,000 miles, whichever comes sooner. But you can check the sticker on the back and make sure that it has that sticker. And of course, check the paperwork if you're thinking of buying one, because you want to be sure that someone's not just stuck a sticker on it. The battery and motor, however, are warranted for 8 years or 100,000 miles. Now, earlier cars might have had a slightly shorter battery warranty, and of course, the battery leased stuff, the battery warranty is not relevant, and we'll come on to that in a second. So, battery leased or battery owned. That's something that you need to understand and think about on a Renault Zoe. Early cars were only available with a leased battery. So you bought the car and then you paid an additional monthly charge to lease the battery from Renault. That made the car cheaper to buy up front, and upfront purchase cost was a problem with EVs back when the Zoe was young, just as it is today. However, it also was intended to give consumers more confidence. They would know that they had a perpetual warranty on the battery, because that's what the leasing arrangement was. You paid your monthly cost, and if the battery failed, Renault would give you another one. So the monthly fee is a bit like an insurance premium. If you prefer the peace of mind that you pay a fixed amount of money and you know that the car is good for the rest of its life until it falls apart around the battery, then battery lease may be for you. Later on, they found that it was actually holding people back. The monthly charge, because it was quite a large amount of money, was something that people were worried about, and so it was actually stopping adoption of the Zoe rather than helping it. And so they stopped doing battery lease, so you could only own the battery. There was a period where you could choose, but eventually it just became battery owned. It's also worth knowing that some cars with battery lease were bought out. The owner paid a fixed amount of money in order to buy out of the lease arrangement so that they didn't have to pay that monthly charge anymore. So it is possible to get an early car that is battery owned, but make sure that you see the paperwork to prove that that's the case. If you'd like to know more about the specifications of any particular electric car, then the website I would recommend you have a look at is EV Database. That's ev-database.org. This website has a wealth of information about all the vehicles that have been on sale in various markets. So click your particular market and you'll be able to find out about a car that you may be interested in. It is worth knowing, however, that the information available is in two sections. All the cars that are currently available new are listed on the home page. But if you want to know about an older car, something that is no longer available, even if it's only because the trim that you're interested in is not still available, then scroll to the bottom of the page and click the archive link to find out about those older cars. Okay, well that's it for another video. Thanks very much for joining me. I'd love to hear your questions, comments and feedback in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, then I'd appreciate you clicking the thumbs up button. That shows YouTube that you've appreciated it, and it may promote it to other people who will enjoy it. And click subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks.